Waitress, one arrogant billionaire, and a grand piano. What began as a smug attempt to publicly embarrass her ended in a moment that froze the entire restaurant and deflated egos on the spot. You won't believe how she flipped the script with nothing but her raw talent. It was a balmy Saturday night, and the buzz of conversation floated through Bellamy's, an elegant bistro nestled in the center of Charleston, South Chicago. The soft ring of cutlery, the gentle shuffle of waitstaff, and the low sultry notes of live jazz from a baby grand in the corner painted the perfect picture of sophistication. Maria, a 24-year-old waitress with a calm presence and a quiet fire behind her eyes, moved gracefully from table to table, balancing entree and polite laughter. To most guests, she was just another uniformed employee, but beneath the surface she harbored dreams far beyond the velvet-covered chairs and white linen tables. Maria lived for music. The piano had been her voice since childhood, her comfort, her release, her identity. But reality demanded rent, not recital. Her job at Bellamy's was a means to an end, a temporary stop on the long road to the conservatory she longed to attend. Only a few knew what she was capable of. Fellow staff who'd stumbled upon her, quietly playing the old piano in the storage room during her short breaks. That night, as the dinner crowd mellowed, the door opened, and in strolled Mike Tate, unmistakable in both reputation and attitude. A tech mogul with a flair for the dramatic Mike walked like the restaurant belonged to him. Trailed by a few equally smug associates, he radiated arrogance and charm in equal measure. Maria's co-workers exchanged subtle glances. Mike wasn't the easiest guest. He was known for treating service-like performance his own. But for Maria, he was just one more high-maintenance table on a long shift. Still, something about her caught his attention. As his eyes scanned the room, they landed on her and lingered. A quick smirk followed. She felt the weight of his look, but didn't flinch, focusing instead on her tray and the next task at hand. But Mike wasn't letting it go that easily. He had already made up his mind. She would be his amusement for the evening. Maria had been raised in a quiet rural town in Georgia, a place where aspirations of greatness often felt as unreachable as the moon. Her mother, a determined single parent, worked long hours as a nurse, often juggling double shifts just to make sure there was dinner on the table for Maria and her two younger brothers. Money was tight, but music was always present in their home. Her mother's old cassette tapes and the dented upright piano passed down by a neighbor became the foundation of Maria's love for melody. That piano, slightly out of tune and missing a few ivories, became her sanctuary. While the neighborhood kids rode bikes and played tag, Maria spent her time pressing keys, recreating pop songs by ear, before gradually exploring classical scores she discovered in old library books. Her talent began to turn heads. She played at school assemblies, church services, and small-town fairs. But even applause couldn't erase the reality that followed her. The barrier between talent and opportunity was money. By the time she hit 19, it was clear a music degree would have to wait. Grants fell through, bills piled up, and family came first. So Maria folded her performance dreams away like sheet music, replacing them with the resolve to support herself however she could. But she never truly let go. Music wasn't just something she loved, it was who she was. When she relocated to Charleston a few years earlier, she had applied at Bellamy's not just for the paycheck, but because of the grand piano nestled in the corner near the wine bar. Though she rarely had a chance to play it, its presence grounded her. The music hadn't left her. It was just waiting. That night, as Mike and his party settled into their corner booth, Maria approached the table. Tray balanced expertly in one hand. Mike ordered a vintage bourbon and tossed out a joke loud enough to draw chuckles from nearby tables. Maria gave a courteous smile while jotting down the orders, her tone composed even as she picked up on the strange edge in his attention. "Maria," he said, squinting briefly at her name tag. "That sounds like someone with a secret talent or two." The remark caught her slightly off guard, but she acknowledged it with a polite nod before walking away. She didn't catch the sly smirk he exchanged with his companions or the way his gaze lingered long after she turned her back. But Mike wasn't just watching, he was scheming. And before the night was over, Maria would become the focus of a performance she never signed up for. The night unfolded much like any other, filled with soft laughter, the clinking of silverware, and the distant melody of the piano drifting through the air. Maria kept her rhythm steady, doing her best to avoid Mike's lingering gaze as she moved from table to table. She'd handled her share of difficult customers, but there was something about him that felt different. It wasn't just arrogance. It was intentional calculated. His presence had a weight to it, a tension that made her skin crawl. By the time the appetizers were on the table, Mike had already launched into his show, though not the kind Maria expected. He was putting on a performance holding court with exaggerated tales of triumph, laced with veiled insults aimed at people with no drive. His companions laughed on cue while surrounding guests exchanged annoyed glances, clearly tired of his volume. Maria focused on her work, keeping her head down, until she returned to his table with a bottle of red. That's when he blindsided her. "So tell me, Maria," he said loudly, slicing through the ambiance with his voice, "what do you really do when you're not delivering entree? A woman like you must have a dream or two." The sudden attention made her hand falter slightly as she placed the bottle down. She forced a smile. "I play piano sometimes," she said gently, hoping that would satisfy him and end the conversation. But Mike's expression lit up with a spark she didn't like. "A pianist. Well, isn't that charming?" he said, grinning as if he'd discovered a new toy. "Why don't you treat us to a little concert?" Maria froze. For a moment, the room itself seemed to pause. Conversation softened. Eyes drifted toward the scene. "Oh, I couldn't," she replied quickly, laughing nervously. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Mike wasn't backing off. "Nonsense," he boomed. "The piano's right there. Surely someone with big dreams isn't afraid of a little audience." Sanam, his friends laughed, clearly entertained, while nearby diners turned to watch. Maria's chest tightened. The heat of their attention burned through her uniform. She wanted to walk away, to disappear, but Mike's words lingered, loud and cutting. "I really shouldn't," she stammered, glancing around as if anyone might step in. But her coworkers remained frozen, uncertain. Mike leaned back in his seat, swirling his glass with that same smug grin. "Ah," he said with mock disappointment, "all dreams, no courage. What a shame." The words hit harder than she expected. Dismissive belittling meant to humiliate. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She wasn't confrontational by nature, but this cut deep, and somewhere in the back of her mind, her mother's voice rose above the noise. "Don't ever let someone decide your worth for you, Maria. You are more than they'll ever see." A hush settled between them. Maria looked at the piano, then back at Mike. His smirk dared her to fold, and against every instinct that told her to stay small, she stepped forward. "Fine," Maria said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll play." A hush spread through the restaurant like a sudden change in pressure. Every eye followed her as she walked toward the piano. Each step a battle between apprehension and resolve. The soft clink of silverware ceased. Conversations faded into murmurs, and by the time she reached the gleaming grand piano tucked into the corner, it felt as though the entire room had paused to witness a showdown. The light from the overhead fixture caught her in its beam, casting her in a pool of warmth and nerves. She sat down slowly, her palms lightly brushing the polished keys, cool and indifferent beneath her touch. Behind her, Mike leaned back with an amused grin, arms crossed as though he were already celebrating a win. Maria closed her eyes for a moment. Her chest rose and fell with one steadying breath. This wasn't the community center or her grandmother's living room. This wasn't safe. This was judgment scrutiny spectacle. But she wasn't backing down. Her hands found their place, and the first notes floated out, soft, tentative, like a whisper daring to be heard. A chair scraped somewhere in the background. Someone cleared their throat. She ignored it all. She leaned in. She chose a piece etched into her bones, one she had played 1,000 times in private, but never like this. Debut's Clair de Lune, tender and luminous. The melody spilled into the air, fragile but unwavering, wrapping around the stillness in the room like silk. As the notes bloomed, so did her confidence. Her hands moved with the fluency of years lost to late-night practice sessions and quiet yearning. The music swelled each chord, a piece of her truth. The exhaustion of sacrifices made the dreams she buried under rent payments and bus schedules, the ache of knowing how much she had to give, but never being asked. Conversations died. Forks rested untouched. Even Mike, who had been half laughing with his friends just minutes before, sat wordless now. Maria didn't need to look to feel the shift. The atmosphere had changed. The arrogance had drained from the air, replaced by something unspoken and heavy. She didn't hold back. The crescendo rose like a declaration. Her soul spilled from her fingertips. Emotion shaped into melody. And for the first time in years, she wasn't background noise. She wasn't invisible. She was heard. By the time the final note echoed into silence, the room was frozen in stillness. The last sound hung in the air like a held breath, refusing to disappear. Maria sat motionless, her fingers resting on the keys, heart pounding as she waited for whatever came next. Then, as if a spell had been lifted, the room erupted in applause. It was instant, loud, and full of life, echoing off the walls and wrapping around Maria like a warm embrace she hadn't expected. Some guests rose to their feet, clapping with a sincerity that brought a sting of tears to her eyes. Her coworkers joined in from the sidelines, their faces glowing with pride and surprise, but Mike remained seated. The smug grin that had followed him in was gone, replaced by a blank expression she couldn't quite place. Part stunned, part uneasy. He eventually raised his hands and gave a slow, reluctant clap, hollow measured, but even his half-hearted gesture couldn't touch what had just happened. Maria had reclaimed something tonight. Her voice, her worth, and no amount of arrogance or belittling could ever take it from her again. As the applause tapered off, the restaurant exhaled in unison. Maria rose from the bench, legs still trembling, but her posture tall. She looked around, and for the first time all night, she saw them not as strangers in suits and heels, but as people who had witnessed something real. Their expressions weren't just polite, they were filled with something deeper: respect, admiration, even awe. She didn't look at Mike right away. Instead, she gave a soft nod to a couple seated near the front who had applauded the loudest, her lips lifting into a small but genuine smile. It wasn't pride swelling in her chest. It was relief. Relief that fear hadn't won, that she'd chosen herself when it mattered most. Then her gaze, as if drawn by gravity, found Mike again. He sat with his hands folded neatly on the table now. The confidence he wore like armor noticeably cracked. His face was unreadable, like he hadn't decided whether to concede or double down. "Well," he said finally, voice just a little too loud for the stillness that remained. "That was unexpected." He gave a dry laugh, missing the charm he usually carried. Guest talent shows up in the most surprising places. The comment landed with a dull weight. His friends exchanged uncomfortable looks, unsure if they should respond or pretend not to hear. Maria tilted her head slightly. She recognized the attempt. It was supposed to be a compliment, an olive branch, but it was empty, coated in pride, stripped of sincerity. "Thank you," she said, voice calm and measured. There was no heat, no venom, but no softness either. She wasn't going to let him drag her back into the small space he'd tried to trap her in. Her music had already said everything she needed to say. Mike cleared his throat, visibly squirming under the weight of so many silent eyes. He motioned to a nearby server for another drink, clearly trying to reclaim some semblance of control. "You've got quite a gift," he added, forced and almost resentful. Maria didn't flinch. She nodded once, gaze locked. "Everyone does," she replied, her voice low and sure. "Some of us just stop hiding it. It's how you choose to use it that matters." The words weren't loud, but they cut through the room like a final note, ringing clear and true. A hush followed, brief but heavy. Maria's reply wasn't angry, wasn't smug, yet it carried more weight than anything Mike had said all night. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the confident posture he'd worn like a shield now visibly eroding. Diners slowly began returning their focus to their meals, but the entire mood of the restaurant had changed. The quiet hum of exclusivity and curated elegance had been replaced with something deeper. Respect, reflection, maybe even admiration for the young woman who had reminded them that real power doesn't need to shout. But it wasn't just embarrassment that Mike wore now. It was exposure. Whatever game he had been playing had collapsed, and no amount of smooth talking could patch it back together. The room had seen through him. Maria stepped away from the piano, her pulse still racing, but her steps steady. The magnitude of what had just happened settled over her, not as a burden, but as a quiet affirmation. Her coworkers met her with soft smiles and small nods, subtle gestures that carried volumes. She had a shift to finish, sure, but something inside her had changed. Her spine straighter, her eyes brighter, her presence firmer. At Mike's table, the energy had evaporated. The friends who had once echoed his laughter now stared into their drinks, or at their plates, avoiding eye contact, as if looking at Maria might make them accountable too. The noise from that corner of the restaurant, once filled with self-importance and smug superiority, had given way to silence and sideways glances. The evening carried on. Maria moved from table to table with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't performing anymore. She was owning her space. More than one diner paused her gently. An older woman reached out as Maria set down a dessert. "You were extraordinary," she whispered misty-eyed. "Don't stop." A man near the bar leaned over during a refill and said with quiet conviction, "That was real. Don't let anyone dim that." Maria offered grateful nods and soft thank yous. These weren't just compliments. They were acknowledgments. They were fuel. But not every interaction was so gracious. When she approached Mike's table to drop the check, his expression had shifted into something tighter, resentful. Maybe laced with the faintest edge of reluctant respect, he glanced up at her, the corner of his mouth twitching. "You made your point," he muttered, almost bitter. "No need to drag it out." Maria met his eyes without flinching. "It was never about making a point," she said, her tone even. "I just wanted to play." There was nothing else he could say. He looked away, fingers drumming on the side of his glass, the once commanding figure now sitting in the awkward silence of his own making. The power had shifted completely, and everyone, especially Mike, knew it. As Mike scribbled his name across the receipt, one of his companions, a younger man with gentler eyes and a quieter demeanor, glanced up at Maria and said, "You were incredible. Truly." The genuineness in his voice caught her off guard. For a fleeting moment, she saw a sliver of sincerity in a group she had long dismissed as shallow. "Thank you," she replied with a soft smile before turning and walking away. When the night came to a close, Mike and his entourage slipped out without fanfare, their typical dramatic exit replaced by a quiet, uneasy departure. Maria watched them leave, feeling neither vindication nor resentment. She wasn't dwelling on Mike anymore. Her mind had already moved on toward what came next. The tips that evening had been unusually generous enough to cover her rent and still leave a little extra, just enough to finally book those piano lessons she'd been putting off. As she locked the doors and stepped into the crisp night air, something inside her felt different, lighter, stronger. It wasn't just the glow of a small victory. It was clarity. She wasn't just a waitress, and she wasn't just someone who once dreamed of something bigger. She was a musician, and nothing, no smug insult, no financial pressure, no fear could take that truth away from her. By the time she reached her modest apartment, her thoughts weren't on the past, but on the possibility of what lay ahead. She sat down on the faded bench in front of her old upright piano. Its keys chipped, its sound slightly muted. It didn't have the grandeur of Bellamy's Shining Baby Grand, but it didn't need to. The music was still hers, and it flowed from the same place it always had, her heart. Something had shifted inside her that night. Not just a fleeting sense of victory, but a deeper understanding. Her talent wasn't something she had to defend or explain. It simply was, and that was enough. In the days that followed, her performance became something of a quiet legend. Diners who had been there retold the story about the waitress who shut down a millionaire with nothing but grace and music. Word began to spread, and just a few days later, Maria received a phone call. A music producer who had been dining that night visiting from Atlanta had tracked her down through the restaurant. He wasn't offering superstardom, but he was offering something real: studio time, a chance to record a demo, a first step. Maria said yes, not because she thought it would change everything overnight, but because it felt like a door cracking open. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to walk through it. For years, Maria had allowed fear and self-doubt to whisper lies in her ear, telling her she wasn't ready, that her dreams were too far-fetched, that she would never be enough. But now the truth stood before her, undeniable. Her resilience, her quiet authenticity, and her unshakable love for her craft were her greatest strengths. What happened with Mike Bellamy hadn't just been a public humiliation flipped on its head. It was a revelation, a reminder that real power doesn't come from money, bravado, or control. It comes from integrity, from refusing to shrink. Mike, with all his wealth and smug charm, could never take away what made her who she was. He stood as a symbol of every voice that had ever told her she couldn't or shouldn't, and she silenced him without argument, without rage, but with something purer: her music. To anyone watching her story unfold, Maria's message was unmistakable. Never let someone else define your worth. The world is full of Mike's people who mask their own insecurities by belittling others. But real strength is found in standing firm in your truth, letting your passion speak louder than their cynicism. As she gently closed the piano lid and rested her fingers on the worn wood, Maria smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time it truly felt like it had begun. So what about you? What dream have you been pushing aside because fear told you to wait? Don't let the world's noise drown out your own voice. Don't wait for a moment like Maria's. Create your own. And if this story moved you, subscribe for more stories of quiet strength, resilience, and unexpected triumph. Because the next story, it could be yours.